Karen Armstrong is a British author of 12 books on comparative religion and an authority on world faiths, religious fundamentalism, and monotheism. Rising to prominence in 1993 with the book A History of God, Armstrong's work focuses on commonalities among major religions and the importance in many of compassion or the Golden Rule, which she explains like so. All the great traditions are saying the same thing in much the same way, despite their surface differences. They each have in common, she explains, an emphasis on the transcendent importance of compassion as epitomized in the Golden Rule. Do unto others as you would have others do unto you. In 1962, while still in her teens, Karen had become a nun in the Society of the Holy Child Jesus, a teaching order in which she remained for 7 years. Once she had advanced from postulant and novice to professed nun, she enrolled in college, Oxford, to study English. Her thoughts went from a conservative to a more liberal and mystical faith. In 1969, Armstrong left her order and embarked on a doctorate on the poet Tennyson at Oxford. Her dissertation was failed by her examiner on the grounds that the topic had been unsuitable. Armstrong did not formally protest this verdict, but instead abandoned hope of an academic career. Today, Armstrong, who went on to teach religion in many great universities, says she was particularly inspired by the traditional emphasis on practice as well as faith. On the other hand, Karen Armstrong maintains that fundamentalism is not just a religious response, but ironically a product of contemporary culture, and thus articulates that we urgently need to make compassion a clear, luminous, and dynamic force in our polarized world. Rooted in a principled determination to transcend selfishness, compassion can break down political, dogmatic, ideological, and religious boundaries. It is the path to enlightenment and is indispensable to the creation of a just economy and a peaceful global community. Armstrong's works have sparked worldwide debate, and consequently she has created the Charter of Compassion, a universal framework for understanding religion based on the principles of justice and respect, and for making the authentic voice of religion a power in a world conducive to peace. In today's interview with Intellect, we will see why Karen Armstrong has clearly proven to be a bridge between religions.
Religion is certainly a shaper of our world, and policymakers should take account of religion and the state of religion in a given region, just as they look at the economy and agriculture and industry and other components, because religion shapes worldviews and it shapes values. Therefore, it can be a force for immense good, because all the world religions teach the importance of compassion, respect for the other, whoever he or she may be, and that is desperately needed in our global world. But it's also true, unfortunately, that some forms of religion tend to stretch the exclusivity of their tradition and are less open. People have found globalization threatening, and many have retreated into sort of denominational ghettos in a way, and erected barriers of fear and anxiety against the other. So a religion, it depends very well how you do it, whether it's a force for good or not in the world. That's the responsibility of each individual. The word unskillful it's a Buddhist term, and instead of saying religion is bad or wrong, which are sort of value-laden and which are imposing your views on somebody else's, Buddhists prefer to say that a certain action or a certain way of speaking is unskillful, akusala. That means that it's not helpful to us, it's not wholesome, and so it's less value laden. It asks you to think of whether this idea or practice will actually help you and help the world in the long term. Well, I think that people are beginning to celebrate this. And the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, my people will be blessed if there is diversity of opinion among them. And I think this is happening in our world. During the 20th century, because of increased communications and better language skills, we got to know about the essence and the meaning of people's religious ideas and religious thoughts more than had been possible before hitherto. We saw not only what they did and what they believed, but what the spiritual impulse was behind it. And that has resulted in a major change for many people. More and more people are turning for nourishment to more than one faith. And they're not doing that with that doesn't mean they're abandoning their own. They're just finding things that emphasize aspects or give a new twist to their own religious tradition. A lot of Western people avidly reading Rumi, the Sufi poet. I think more Christians read the Jewish philosopher Martin Buber than Jews do. And Jews read the Protestant theologians Paul Tillich and Harvey Cox. Jesuits are learning meditation from Buddhist or Zen monks. So we're ready to learn from one another, and without sacrificing your own tradition, but to learn the wisdom that underlies all the major faiths. Now, some people, however, are threatened by this pluralism, and that has caused certain fear and tension and a tendency to overemphasize the exclusiveness of particular religious tradition. But people are beginning to celebrate it in the Sufi way, where, a Sufi poet would often cry aloud in ecstasy that once he'd glimpsed the sacred transcendence that lay behind religious forms, he was neither Jew, Christian, Muslim, or could be at home equally in a synagogue, mosque, temple or church, because these human distinctions fell behind. But because the transcendent is illimitable, because it goes beyond anything we can think or grasp, even though we can get intimations and insight into it, therefore there are bound to be diverse ways of speaking about it, and no one can really have the last word. I like that in the Quran, where it says, vie with one another in good works. And I think that is what we can do. Instead of trying to sit down earnestly and say, how can we make our religious beliefs cohere and agree? Let us agree to differ and relish the differences, because it reminds us always that God is always greater, Allahu Akbar. But we have many shared values, and we can work together for a better world, engaging in the problems that beset humanity, such as the political and economic polarization, injustice, poverty. These are religious issues because they concern our fellow human beings and their well-being, both ultimate and here in the present. So the British theologian C.S. Lewis is not someone I quote very often, but that he had a phrase that stuck with me when I read it first as a schoolgirl. He was talking about, it's in his book, The Four Loves, and he is distinguishing between eros, where two people gaze rapt into each other's eyes and want to merge with one another, and friendship, where two people are not looking at one another but have they're standing side by side and have their eyes fixed on a common goal. And I think this friendship is something that we can relish between religious faiths. We're not asking to merge into some sort of a world religion. Let's keep the particularity of that tradition and that genius, and relish difference, just as we relish the difference in our friends. with whom we don't always agree, but that doesn't make us love them any the less. But be standing shoulder to shoulder with our eyes fixed on a common goal for the human race and work together as friends to improve it. I think that secularism, as it began in Europe, was trying to extricate Europeans from the hatred and war that they'd experienced between them in Europe in the early throes of modernization. We had the Reformation, which resulted in killing and death. It got bound up with nationalism, and the most awful bigotries occurred during the great wars of religion, so-called, in the 17th century. And the philosophers of the Enlightenment said, let's take religion out of all this. And the idea of it was to free religion from this kind of bigotry and misuse. But of course, there's now brought a kind of secular fundamentalism, which sees any form of religion now as bad. Now that's not tolerant. That is denying the principles that were supposed to be enshrined in the Enlightenment. The humanist ideal is supposed to give you a respect for human beings, and that will include their most sacred values. And if a society fails in that, it is failing not just its own ideology, but its very humanity, because we are all a part of one another. So tolerance was supposed to be the result of the secular society, and it has resulted in some parts of the world, particularly in Europe, in a sort of slight disdain for religion, and that's not healthy. But really, toleration, like democracy, is less a product of an ideology, but it's more a product of industrialization. These are industrial virtues, if you like, and were found to be essential to the functioning of a productive capitalist state. And so when it's sort of motivated often by finance and by industry and industrial output and all these capitalist notions, then tolerance can very easily degenerate into seeing people as cogs or means to an end. And that's not founded on respect. That's not tolerance at all. That's simply using the human resources at your disposal to increase your gross national product. And we found in the 1930s and 40s how very skin deep that tolerance was in Europe, and how the ideals of the Enlightenment failed, because there you found that a great university could exist in the same vicinity as a concentration camp, and that far from freeing humanity from bigotry, we just created new ones, and the old hatreds had been simmering under the surface all the time. I personally would prefer to go beyond tolerance now. Tolerance, the Latin root, means to put up with, to bear, as though this was some dreadful duty. You're putting up with other people. It's very rather grudging. I think now the challenge is to move to appreciation, the appreciation of the richness of other traditions, and appreciation and, as you say, celebration of difference and different diverse traditions. What do you mean by the core values of your faith? If you try to distinguish between what is actually good for humanity and what is bad for humanity, I think relativism is scorned because it tends to be a dilution and looking for the lowest common denominator. Whereas, in fact, a true celebration and a true tolerance means looking beneath the surface of a belief or a practice and looking to what lies at its heart, and going beyond the superficial and the skin deep, but delving down into the profound insight that some of these practices have inspired, so that And I think that if we do that, that constant exercise of looking beneath the surface, looking for the spark of divinity or the sacred that lies at the root of all traditions, then we can't go wrong. Then we are, because then we have an increased sense that sacredness is universal. And each tradition has its own particular genius and its own particular insight that doesn't compromise ours, because nobody can have the last word upon it. And our traditions are all changing. Our traditions are all changing. They've changed enormously. I often think, what on earth would Jesus have said if he came back and saw the Vatican or the Lambeth Conference? Christianity has moved beyond all recognition, and this is essential to any tradition, faith tradition in a sense. It is in a constant dialogue with events on the ground. You have a transcendent reality that is beyond earthly concerns, and you have changing current events down here that affects our view of the world, and our views have changed, and they will be changed by the encounter with another. Very often dialogue, that word that people use about religious conversation between faiths, it's often conducted in the spirit of proving that mine's the best and I'd like you to convert to mine. And that's not dialogue, that's a kind of diatribe. Dialogue means that you're going to listen to what the other person says, and as in any interaction with a human being, you will be changed and hopefully enriched by the encounter. We shouldn't hang on to our traditions as though we're frightened that they'll all disintegrate if we lose one dot of their expression. I think that when Muslims were confident, they did not have these problems. One has to remember that for centuries the Muslim world was far more tolerant of minorities than Christian West. There's just no question about it, no comparison. And of course the Quran has its own calling to a wider outlook, saying, at one point God says to the Prophet, peace be upon him, if we had wanted to make all humanity one single ummah, we would have done so. But this apparently was not God's will. Diversity is God's will. Now, but I think when people are not confident, that is when insecurities come out, and when people feel the need to hold back the forces that are about to destroy them. I think the colonial experience began to dint the confidence of some Muslims. The way the colonials, British, French, Italians came in